Good morning and happy Groundhog's Day. Just wanted to come on here because I haven't been on here in a while, and wanted to wish you a happy Groundhog Day and come on here and read a fun story about Groundhog's Day. I know Punxsutawney Phil saw his shadow this morning, which means 6 more weeks of winter, but if you actually go look at a calendar, it is 6 weeks until spring starts. So the title of the book that I'm going to read this morning, or this afternoon, it's after 12 here, is Wake Up Groundhog by Susanna Leonard Hill, illustrated by Jeffrey Ebbeler. Now this was originally published with the title Punxsutawney Phyllis. This was one of our oldest son's favorite books when he was little. So I'm going to read it to you this morning. So Wake Up Groundhog by Susanna Leonard Hill, illustrated by Jeffrey Ebbeler. Phyllis was not like the other groundhogs. She liked to get up in February instead of in March. She liked to be outdoors instead of indoors. When spring rain soaked the earth and everyone else huddled in the burrows, Phyllis splashed in puddles. "You're sopping wet," her mother scolded. "I like the way the mud feels between my toes," Phyllis explained. Her mother shook her head and said to Phyllis's father, "That's Phyllis." When the stream water rushed icy cold and fierce between the banks, Phyllis went wading. "You'll catch a cold," Aunt Patsy warned. Phyllis's mother just shook her head. "That's Phyllis." When the August sun beat down, turning the meadow brown, Phyllis picked blackberries warm and sweet. "You'll bake in this heat," Aunt Sassy cried. And guess what Phyllis's mother said? Right, that's Phyllis. "When I grow up," Phyllis said, "I'm going to be Punxsutawney Phil." "Don't be silly, dear," her mother said. "Punxsutawney Phil is a fellow." The other grown-ups laughed, but Phyllis knew she could do it even if no one took her seriously. And then one February morning, Phyllis woke up early. She crawled out of bed and crept up the tunnel. The first light of morning shone at the mouth of the groundhog hole. From the big pine trees came the steady drip, drip, drip of snow melting. Running water whispered in the brook. The air was sharp, but something about it had changed. Spring was coming early. She skipped back down the tunnel to wait for Uncle Phil to wake up and make his prediction. "Phyllis, would you quit wiggling?" complained Phil Jr. "Yes, Phyllis," said Pete. "Some of us are trying to sleep." "How can you sleep when spring is in the air?" asked Phyllis. Phil Jr. looked at Pete. "Only Phyllis would think spring was coming in the middle of winter," he said. "It's not the middle of winter," Phyllis said. "It's Groundhog Day." But Phil Jr. and Pete were already dozing off. Pretty soon, Aunt Sassy got up and tried to wake Uncle Phil. She shook him and tugged his whiskers. She shouted in his ear. Everyone else in the burrow woke up, but Uncle Phil kept right on snoring. "What's all that ruckus?" asked old Grandfather Groundhog. "It's Groundhog Day," said Aunt Sassy, "and Phil's still asleep. I'm afraid he's getting too old for the job." "I'll do it," Phyllis said eagerly. Everyone laughed. "Punxsutawney Phil has never been a girl," said Pete. "And never will be," Phil Jr. taunted. "Nobody's going to get the job until Phil gives it up," said Aunt Sassy. "Now how are we going to wake him?" "Dump snow on him," Phyllis suggested. "Good idea," said Aunt Sassy. It worked. Uncle Phil grumbled. "It's time to get up," said Aunt Sassy. "It's Groundhog Day." "I'm sleepy," complained Uncle Phil. "If you're too tired," said Phyllis, "I'd be happy to do the job for you." "Hm," replied Uncle Phil. "Not just anyone can be Punxsutawney Phil." "I'm not just anyone," said Phyllis. "Is your name Phil?" asked Uncle Phil. "No," Phyllis admitted. "But Punxsutawney Phil's real name isn't always Phil." "Yes, well," grumbled Uncle Phil, "but were you born on Groundhog Day?" "I was born the day after," Phyllis said. "Not good enough," said Uncle Phil. Besides, you are a girl. When the time comes, one of those young fellows will fit the ticket." Phil Jr. and Pete smirked. "They can't even feel that spring is in the air," Phyllis said scornfully. "We never have an early spring," said Uncle Phil. "In all my years as Punxsutawney Phil, it's never happened once." "It's going to happen this year," Phyllis said stubbornly. Aunt Patsy chuckled. "That's Phyllis," she said. "Phyllis wished people would stop saying that." "Phyllis, come with me and see what the world looks like in February," said Uncle Phil. "Then you'll know that I'm right." Phyllis couldn't believe her luck. They walked up the long tunnel and emerged into the light. Uncle Phil sat up on his hind legs and sniffed the air. "Just as I thought," he said. 6 more weeks of winter." "Early spring," insisted Phyllis. "Look at all that snow," said Uncle Phil. "Feel the cold." "The snow is melting," said Phyllis. "The water is running in the brook." Uncle Phil tilted his head and listened. "So it is," he said softly. "I don't hear as well as I used to." "The chickadees are singing their spring song," said Phyllis. "I have never heard the chickadees on Groundhog Day," said Uncle Phil. "And look, Uncle Phil, no shadows." "My eyes aren't as clear as they used to be," said Uncle Phil. "And don't you smell the sweetness of spring?" asked Phyllis. Uncle Phil sniffed. "Just a hint," he murmured. "And there's something else," said Phyllis. She had finally figured out what had felt different about the air all morning. "Feel the wind? It's from the west, the spring zephyr." "Well, I'll be jiggered," said Uncle Phil. "Phyllis was right," Uncle Phil announced when they returned to the burrow. "We are going to have an early spring. It's time for me to retire." "But who will be the next Punxsutawney Phil?" asked Aunt Patsy. "I will," said Phil Jr. "No, I will," said Pete. "Sorry, boys," said Uncle Phil. "You missed the signs, too." "You can't mean," blustered Phil Jr. "Yes, boys," said Uncle Phil. "That this time the best Phil for the job is a Phyllis." "What about the rules?" whined Phil Jr. and Pete. "If Mother Nature can bend the rules once in a while," said Uncle Phil, "we can too." Phyllis heard the water in the brook and the song of the birds. She saw that there was no shadow, and she felt the spring zephyr. "That's Phyllis," her mother said proudly. Phyllis grinned and said, "Punxsutawney Phyllis." The end. So that is our story, Wake Up Groundhog, otherwise known as Punxsutawney Phyllis. Hope you enjoyed the story, and I hope you have a great rest of your Thursday. And I hope to join you again sometime soon. Until then, God bless.